What's up, YouTube? We're going to talk essential metal today. Biohazard's second record, Urban Discipline. So this right here is my copy. I got this in the East Village a few years ago at a record store. I like to say it was Generation Records. I was just looking to get into some Biohazard. I hadn't really listened to much of their stuff. This actually right here is, I guess, some series Roadrunner did called Two from the Vault, where there's actually two records in here. The second one being the No Holds Barred live record from 1997 that Biohazard did. And I really enjoy that one too, just because you get some raw live performances of some songs from State of the World Address, which is one of my favorite Biohazard albums. So this record came out in 1992 on Roadrunner Records, and it's one of several early 90s Roadrunner classics that came out when they were still very much a budding label for heavy music, and nu metal hadn't yet taken over like it would in the mid to late 90s. So records like Suffocation's Effigy of the Forgotten, Sepultura's Chaos AD, Typo Negative's Bloody Kisses, which was Roadrunner's first gold record. This label put out a lot of game-changing music in the early 90s. And Biohazard's Urban Discipline is definitely at the forefront of that conversation. One of the most significant movements in heavy music in the late 80s and early 90s is what people now refer to as crossover thrash, where more and more hardcore punk bands were incorporating more and more elements of thrash metal in their music, probably to the dismay of hardcore purists, but it created some great records like Agnostic Front's Cause for Alarm, and of course the Anthrax side project's Stormtroopers of Death, and to me, the most blatantly metal crossover record, DRI's third record, Crossover. And a lot of people credit Urban Discipline with taking crossover thrash a step further and fusing with elements of hip-hop, which of course was the other major musical movement that was coming out of New York City at the time. I have an issue with that because people try to frame this record as being 1/3 metal and 1/3 hardcore and 1/3 hip-hop, and that's just not the case when you really listen to it. At its core, no pun intended, this is just a phenomenal hardcore record that brings in a lot of unique influences. For starters, the lyrical themes on here are very much in line with that blue-collar, everyman struggle that's so central to a lot of hardcore punk music. There are sentiments on here of anger at the establishment, and self-empowerment, and dysfunctional urban communities and the violence that occurs within them. It's pretty far removed from what thrash metal bands like Exodus and Overkill were talking about at the time. The opening track, Chamber Spins 3, rails against cops and criminals that are kind of in bed with each other and calls out cops for being paid off and tells criminals that a real man works hard, starves to climb the ropes, not killing for money on the corner selling dope. And you've got a track like Black, White, and Red All Over that deals with the media's false representation of society and their exploitation of human suffering and violence, which that's a problem that's just as prevalent in 2016 as it was in 1992. And there's the song Business, which deals with the commodification of music, which does feel a little hypocritical given that this record would go on to sell over 1 million copies, and it was executive produced by hip-hop mogul Lear Cohen, who's like the first person you think of when you think of the industry, but that doesn't mean the message is any less poignant. So the lyrics don't necessarily have too much to do with metal. Musically, though, the metal influence is definitely present. Not overwhelming like with DRI's Crossover, but present. There's the incorporation of full-on guitar solos on the song Shades of Grey, one of the sickest songs on here. Then there's, of course, the iconic single Punishment, which not only has some thick, chugging thrash riffs, but at 1:20 in, you have the full-on double bass groove that kicks in after the intro sort of builds everything up. God, I love this fucking record. But yeah, there's definitely a significant metal presence in these tracks. My favorite groove on the whole record is in the song Mistaken Identity, that stop-start riff, which was pretty ahead of its time. I'm not going to try to say that Biohazard was the first band to play a riff like this. It's clearly heavily influenced by Pantera's record Cowboys from Hell, but when you think about how integral a groove like this would become to bands like Fear Factory and Sepultura, and later the nu metal movement, it's pretty mind-blowing that Biohazard fused it with hardcore punk in 1992. And they also bring in elements from outside thrash and hardcore, like the acoustic intro in the song Loss, which is just a total surprise because it's the last thing that you would expect after you've had 8 tracks of just bloodbath after bloodbath. But what's also really special about this song is that in dealing with the loss of a close friend, the band turned not only to sadness, but to all-out anger in portions of the song. And anyone who's ever lost somebody close to them knows that a big part of the mourning process is anger. And I feel like there aren't a lot of songs that deal with that side of the coin. So we've got the metal elements, we've got the hardcore punk elements, and now I gotta address the hip-hop thing. Like I said before, Urban Discipline is often credited with infusing hip-hop into the crossover thrash sound. And while I do hear it a little bit, I think people get a little bit carried away with that. In terms of there being actual rapping on this album, a lot of people cite the verses from the song Punishment as an example. But to me, as a big hip-hop fan myself, when I hear these vocals, I don't necessarily hear rapped vocals as much as I hear hardcore punk vocals with a lot more emphasis on rhythm than the hardcore punk that came before this record. Something that illustrates my point is if you listen to the Suicidal Tendencies classic Institutionalized, observe how those vocals are a lot more chaotic and rant-like and not really rhythmic, and compare that to Urban Discipline, you'll see what I mean. These are not bars, these are not rapped bars, but the vocals are way more rhythmic and as a result, in my opinion, more powerful than the vocals on hardcore records of the 80s. What I will say is that a bunch of these lyrical topics overlap considerably with hip-hop. The title track Urban Discipline is a great example. It's all about desperation and the motivation and the drive that comes from that desperation. This desire to escape from your difficult existence. And that's very hip-hop. Not to mention the shout-outs at the end of this track to the various New York City boroughs. That's very hip-hop too. And also just the overall tough guy aesthetic of this record. That reminds me of something that I love about a lot of hip-hop too. Urban Discipline just has this confrontational attitude to it. This whole, if you approach me, I'm gonna fuck you up kind of thing. Like the song Wrong Side of the Tracks. When you're in fucking Brooklyn, you best watch your back! That, by the way, that song was actually re-recorded from a version on their debut, but this is clearly the definitive version of this song. Urban Discipline is a fucking influential album when you really think about it. Whenever I hear the song Shades of Grey, which might be my favorite on here, I can't help but hear all these similarities to that classic first Hatebreed record, whether it be the production, or the riffs, or the breakdowns. And yeah, I guess you can give this record a little bit of credit for the whole nu metal, rap metal thing, but I personally don't subscribe to that as much. Urban Discipline is just such a tough, muscular album, and it gives me the aggression and the adrenaline rush that metal gives me, but it also gives me that in-your-face social commentary that I get from punk music and from hip-hop. So this is an awesome listen if you're a metal fan that wants a fuck ton of groove and heaviness, but also wants something that approaches that from really a whole different musical perspective. So check this album out if you haven't, and I really hope you dig it. As always, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, or shoot me a message so we can continue to talk music, and I'll see you guys soon.